Hello, good afternoon. So for those just joining, thank you very much. This is the third session of today's 2024 Como UK Shared Transport Conference. And this is about the sustainable and inclusive version of the EV transition. My name's George Beard. I'm head of new mobility at TRL, and I'm very pleased to be sharing this session. We've got a great lineup of speakers. For those of you still joining, please do drop a note in the chat to say who you are and where you're from, and please use the chat function as well throughout the session today to write any questions for our speakers. The speakers are up on screen now. What we'll do is each of them will present in turn, and after each one, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So yeah, please do pop them in the chat, or if you prefer to come on screen and ask it in person, you're welcome to do that at the end. Yeah, this is about the inclusive and sustainable EV transition. I guess I thought it might be helpful just to kick things off with some very brief background and key facts, which I guess most of you in the room will be familiar with, but hopefully it helps set the scene. And that is a scene where we have in the region of 34 million cars on UK roads today. And we know that this car dominance, this heavy car use, has a huge negative impact on climate change and air quality, of course, amongst other things. And to reduce this impact, it's clear that the future of cars is electric, but I think also the future of transport can't just be electric cars. So we need to think broader than just a like-for-like swap of those 34 million to 34 million private electric cars in future. This doesn't mean no cars, of course. Cars still have a role to play in our future, but it does mean substantially fewer cars and fewer trips. And car clubs, which will be the focus of most of today, have tremendous potential here to help generate this massive shift in behaviour that we need. So that's sort of the broad scene that we're discussing today. How can we enhance the benefits of car clubs, increase numbers, both in terms of overall usage and diversity of users, and how can we use car clubs to support this transition to clean transport? So without further ado, then let's move on to our first speaker, which is Jo Lindsay, Senior Transport Planner at the London Borough of Hackney. Jo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Just got to work out how to share. Sorry, one moment. Can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, hello. So my name's Jo Lindsay. I'm a Sustainable Transport Planner for Hackney Council. And I'll talk to you today about the electric car club pilot in Hackney. So some information about Hackney. Hackney is an inner London borough with low levels of car ownership, but it still suffers from poor air quality. 70% of households don't own a private vehicle, and we're committed to reducing private vehicle ownership. And that's in line with our Mayor's Manifesto commitment from 2022 to provide a total of 300 car club vehicles in the borough, ensuring that at least 50% of these are emissions-free at the tailpipe. So in terms of the history of car clubs in Hackney, we've got a long history of supporting car clubs. One second. We've got approximately 230 car club vehicles in the borough at the moment. We support 3 operators, and we run different types of models for car clubs as well. So we have back to base, we have back to zone, and we have flex as well. At the moment, around 80 of our vehicles are EVs, and we have a target of electrifying half of the fleet, as I said, by 2026. That's 150 car club vehicles that will be electric by 2026. This is a map of our current distribution of car club vehicles in the borough. And this is the current active numbers with the view to expand in the next year. So how are we going to support the expansion of electric car clubs? We have an additional concurrent EV program, which we're looking to deliver 3,000 EV charging points by 2026. So a mix of fast chargers, slow chargers, and rapid chargers. That's 2,500 new charging points in an area of 7 square miles by 2026. We want to make sure that the network and the distribution of these locations is equitable, abundant, and accessible. And thinking about inclusivity, for example, we're going to make sure that at least 10% of these charging points are on Hackney estates. So car clubs, how do they fit into the electrification? Well, how does the electrification of car clubs in Hackney work, and then kind of why are we doing this? So ultimately, our main primary goal in Hackney is to reduce the number of vehicles, the number of private vehicles on the road, and we have a key focus on sustainable transportation, so walking and cycling, and we're really looking at our curbside space in the borough to try and see how we can facilitate doing that. But where car clubs come into this, it supports the transition to EVs while cutting the total number of miles down, the total number of miles driven down. So essentially, if there are car trips that need to take place, then we want to be trying to encourage those through car clubs rather than private vehicles. In terms of inclusion, I can just see myself at the bottom here and not see my full screen. But car clubs offer residents the opportunity to test and become familiar with EVs. So we're hoping that this is an opportunity for residents to become familiar, to use EVs, and to understand the process of charging EVs without the upfront cost of having to pay for their own vehicle. As a result, that's more inclusive, and it helps to tackle social exclusion. So what are the barriers to the electrification of the car club fleet in Hackney? One of the main barriers that I think has been identified by Hackney and also by Como as well is the lack of dedicated charging infrastructure, particularly for back-to-base EVs. So those are vehicles that return back to a dedicated bay with lines and signs, and there's a lack of dedicated infrastructure to support those EVs. We've run a number of different trials in the borough over the last couple of years around car clubs, and there are some lessons learned. So we ran a fast charging trial with an EV charging operator, and also a slow charging trial as well with one of our car club operators. So in terms of the fast charging trial, this involved 2 different bays in the borough with dedicated fast charging infrastructure. The fast chargers were on the pavement. Firstly, that goes against our current guidelines of trying to ensure that all infrastructure is on the carriageway rather than the pavement, to minimize any obstructions, to minimize the trip hazards, for example, and any kind of inconvenience to people with mobility issues. And so that was one thing. There was also a communication issue between the car club operator and the EV charging operator for the particular fast charging trial. And there were issues around meetings not happening, and ultimately the car clubs were withdrawn from those bays. Also, there was an issue in terms of the user. So car club users had to download 2 different apps, one for the car club itself, and then one to use the EV charging point. What we want to try and do going forward is make the user experience as seamless as possible. So removing barriers, and one of those barriers, for example, would be having 2 apps when we can only have one, to try and make things as simple for car club users when they're accessing EV charging points. We also had a slow charging trial that ran in the borough. That was 10 hire car vehicles. We worked with hire car, and these operated on a back to zone basis. So that meant that these 10 electric hire car vehicles could park anywhere within a particular parking zone in the borough. Largely successful, but there were some issues around access to charging. So rather than having a dedicated fast charging point for those vehicles, members of staff from hire car had to then go and take those vehicles and charge them overnight on slow charging points, on lamp columns, for example, which is resource intensive for the staff, and the charging points aren't always available, as well as being quite slow. There's lots of shuttling back and forth for staff members having to charge those 10 vehicles. And one of the key bits of feedback from the car club operators that we work with in Hackney is the need or the want for dedicated infrastructure to overcome that barrier. So what's the solution to this? We are currently about to run a dedicated fast charging car club trial. So a bit of background on this: we were awarded £500,000 of external funding from the local electric vehicle infrastructure fund. That's a levy fund. This was match funded by our EV operator. With this, we've installed 70 bays, 35 of which are for public electric vehicle charging and 35 of which for dedicated EV charging. So each charging station has 2 bays. So there are 35 locations in total with 70 bays across those 35 locations. This trial is a real opportunity for some real world testing of EVs, EV car clubs. So we want to understand what the process is. If I'm a car club member and I'm renting out a Zipcar or a hire car or an enterprise vehicle, how do I know how to charge my vehicle at the end of my journey? How do I know what the process is? Is it clear? So this is an opportunity to test the user experience, and it's a kind of pilot to support the wider electrification of Hackney's car club fleet to meet that 150 target of 150 electric vehicles by the end of 2026. We conducted an open market tender, which supported up to 3 operators to then introduce these 35 vehicles, and we'll be awarding contracts this month. So we haven't got any data yet, but let me just talk about the key considerations for the trial, what we wanted to try and achieve. So as I said, the main thing really is it being an initial step for Hackney residents to understand how to access EVs, how to charge EVs, and in an affordable and inclusive way. So there were a couple of key considerations for this, one of which was an accessible design, and this is going to be true across all of our EV fast charging points as well. So rather than having fast charging pillars on the pavement, they're all going to be installed in the road, and therefore access to that EV charging point is step-free. It also reduces the risk of trailing cables and reduces the risk from obstructions and trip hazards on the pavement as well. The fast charging points that we've installed with Zest have had a BSI assessment and they're PAS compliant, which ensures that they're accessible and inclusive for people with mobility issues as well. Coming back to the accessible charging experience, we really want to make sure that this pilot makes it as clear as possible for users as to how to charge their vehicles. We want a seamless customer journey. So with that, there's only one app, and that's the Car Club app. Each Car Club vehicle that's going to be going into these bays will have an allocated radio frequency identification card. So that's an RFID card for charging. So at the end of the journey, I've rented out my Zipcar, for example. I park it in the Car Club bay that you can see here. I then plug in the cable, and then I simply tap the RFID card, and then charging will start for the next customer. We've also worked with Zest, the operator, just to make sure that the communication and instructions for users is as clear as possible. So you can see when you're done, plug in the cable and tap the Zest key tag to start charging, and it should be that simple. And there's a QR code on the charging point, which people can scan on their phones for any issues or any questions from the help desk from Zest as well. So finally, this is going to be a 12-month pilot, and it's going to be a precursor or prelude to the wider tender that we're doing to introduce a total of at least 300 vehicles, car club vehicles in the borough. So the next key step really is to get vehicles in bays, to start monitoring and gathering charging data to understand whether this is going to be a commercially viable model. We want to understand whether the charging rates for EV car clubs are similar, higher, or lower to the charging rates for private vehicles in the adjoining bay. We also want to understand if there are any customer interface issues and whether ultimately we can scale this model up from 35 EV car clubs with fast charging points up to a much higher number to meet that demand in the borough. Both the existing utilization demand and also the potential for growth for car club use in the borough as well. So I hoped to have some data to share today in this meeting. Unfortunately, we don't have that just yet, but maybe we can come back in a year's time and I can share the findings with everyone then. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joe. It's quite an undertaking, very impressive. We have one question in the chat so far, I think. Please do add more questions if you have them. This one's from Anna Sinter. Can you please note who the insurer is for the EV car club and whether you had any difficulties finding this one? I don't know if you're able to answer that.
Yeah, I can't answer that directly. So we have a dedicated EV team with Hackney, and we went through the contract process for contracting the EV operator. I'm unsure of the insurance details, but I can pass that on to my colleagues in the EV team. So the car clubs themselves have their own insurance, and I'm sure James can talk about that in more detail. And there's also associated insurance as well for the fast charging points. Sorry, I can't answer that question in more detail.
That's great, thank you. And another one on accessibility. The charge point looks like the socket is positioned fairly high. Does it meet PAS 1899? And the bollard islands will require wheelchair users to circle around the islands into the road? Question mark.
Yeah, another good question. So my understanding, and I don't know if any of my colleagues are here from Hackney and the EV team that can maybe put an answer in the chat, but is that it's mostly compliant. I'm not sure if it's fully compliant. I think going forward, there's a view that the actual charging interface will be a bit lower to the carriageway. Is my understanding, and so they've all been installed recently, and they're level on the carriageway, so you should be able to access it from the carriageway in a wheelchair. But I can ask my EV colleagues to contribute to that. I think specific EV questions I can try and answer, but we have the dedicated EV team who have a bit more information on this.
Real, okay, thank you. We'll do a couple more and then we'll move on to the next speaker just to short time, but I'll save the questions up if any more come in for the panel at the end. So the next one is, who did you negotiate the match funding with and how did that process occur?
So, sorry, I feel like I'm a broken record here. Again, this was led on by the EV team. So we already had issued the contract to our EV operator Zest at that point. So we had a long-term contract with Zest, and they match funded it. So they're installing all of the infrastructure on the carriageway. But this initial trial, this initial 12-month pilot, is covered by the funding that we were awarded. Really, that's a kind of testing step to the wider electrification. But yeah, any contractual or insurance questions I can pass on to the EV team afterwards.
Real, okay. There are some more questions coming in, but what I'll do is I'll save those for later, and Joe will bring you back at the end, and we can add them into the mix there. Thank you very much, Joe.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. And so, yeah, our next speaker is Chelsea Fleming from Motability Foundation. Chelsea, over to you.
Thanks, George. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. Hopefully, can't see any of my notes. All good. Okay, perfect. So hi, everybody. I'm Chelsea Fleming. I'm an innovation manager at the Motability Foundation. And I'm going to talk through mostly focusing on accessibility as that's kind of our core focus here, around how we should be ensuring that the EV transition is accessible to all. So a little bit about the Motability Foundation. Our kind of elevator pitch at the top here, we fund, support, research and innovate so that all disabled people can make the journeys they choose. We're mostly known for overseeing the Motability scheme at the moment, and we provide grants within our organisation to help people use it, and that provides kind of access to transport to hundreds of thousands of people a year. But more recently, in the last few years, we've expanded our remit and we award grants to other charities and organisations who provide different types of transport or work towards making transport more accessible. And we also carry out a number of different research projects as well, in partnership with disabled people and key stakeholders, which look to kind of inspire innovation and continue to champion accessible transport for all. I'm going to be talking about two different areas. I'll focus on accessible EV charging, as that's been kind of the main thing that we've been working on over the past few years and have the most insight to share. But I'll also share a little bit about some work we're kicking off on accessible vehicle design as well, as those two do go hand in hand to make sure that EV transition is accessible to everyone. So why does EV charging need to be accessible? I think Joe really helpfully kind of started to introduce this, but as many as 1 in 4 people in the UK are living with a disability, and we estimate that kind of 2.7 million disabled drivers will be in the UK by 2035. And up to kind of 50% of those people will be either solely or partially reliant on the public charging infrastructure. And factors that limit accessibility of charge points include kind of plinths and bollards, height, weight and maneuverability of charging cables, the visibility of information on screens and instructions, curb height and lighting. So there are a number of different factors that need to be thought about when you're putting in infrastructure to ensure accessibility. And something that we've tried to support people and support charge point operators and councils and landowners is developing the PAS 1899 standard. So in partnership with government department OZEV, we co-sponsored the long-winded name, not very snappy name, the BSI PAS 1899 Accessible Public Charging Standard. And it was developed with experts working with disabled people, industry bodies, manufacturers, charge point operators, and disability advocacy groups. And it was published in October 2022. And it provides kind of a minimum accessible standard that all types of charge points, as well as supplementary best practice guidance. So there's kind of a minimum standard that all charge points we think should meet. And there's also best practice to make your charge point as accessible as possible. And we also offered up our endorsement of a couple of schemes that can assess that compliance against the PAS. We just finished our kind of first year of that one, and we're just assessing a few applications for our year 2, and we should be able to announce who those schemes will be in the next few weeks. But essentially they're able to kind of support you to ensure that you can understand where you might be meeting the PAS standard and where more support or changes are needed. I guess it's helpful to reflect on how that first year, the first kind of couple of years of the PAS have been. So I wanted to share a bit of a summary of the industry response and uptake of the PAS. So it has been really well received by disabled people and by the EV industry, and we are starting to see some really good examples of providers taking steps to ensure that the charging infrastructure is accessible. But we are aware that full compliance has been really slow to date, and that some providers have found parts of the PAS really difficult to comply with. I guess some context here, the PAS was produced as a rapid standard with the intention to review it after its initial implementation to see whether there are any changes that are required once it's been tested on the ground. We were very conscious that the rollout of charge points were happening very quickly, and we wanted to make sure that there was support there, which is really talking about and advocating for disabled people. But we do understand that a review once it's kind of been implemented and people have trialed it was really important. So we're now working with government and BSI again, and we've sponsored a working group which is looking at what potential revisions to the standard that could be made, and taking on board feedback from both industry and disabled people in that revision as well. So what does that mean? What's next? So an updated version of the standard is likely to be available in the first half of next year. And as I said, we've been taking on board tons of feedback throughout that review. I think it's really important to say that our view is that the PAS should be mandated by law to ensure that all future public charging infrastructure is accessible. And we're going to continue advocating for that, but ultimately it is government's decision. So it's great that we have that working relationship with government, so we can keep talking about it and keep sharing our views. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to do everything we can within our role to improve charge point accessibility. So that's on charging. And something else we think is really important is vehicle design. So this is a new project that we've kicked off in the past few months, and it's kind of stemmed from some research that we did previously. So why is accessible vehicle design important? We commissioned some research in 2022 by the Energy Savings Trust on vehicle design, and that report found that disabled people's requirements are not sufficiently considered in the design and production of standard production vehicles. And kind of in order to satisfy the growing need for EVs for disabled people, it's vital that accessibility and inclusive design is considered. And this move to EVs is really quite a good stepping off point to give us an opportunity to consider accessibility right from the start of that process. And we've also recently completed a new user engagement report that Designability conducted. They're a design and disability charity, and it found that disabled people face significant challenges when making journeys in their current vehicles. And these difficulties include challenges with getting in and out of vehicles, lack of space, seating that doesn't meet their needs, and problems using controls. And issues with accessibility can mean that disabled people don't always get to make the journeys they choose, sometimes completely avoiding driving or traveling altogether. And a couple of really key examples of why that is through that engagement insight is that they can experience pain and discomfort when traveling, or also feeling unsafe or vulnerable in their vehicles. And I guess to say, I know this audience is very much around kind of the shared transport space, but it'll be the same reactions and feelings to using car clubs or other types of transport as well. So what are the next steps? So Designability are now kind of using that insight to be able to kind of show how these issues could be addressed in standard production vehicles through inclusive design. This will involve the creation of a series of accessible design principles, so that that can spark kind of industry to think a little bit differently about how they're designing vehicles, and also show how vehicles should change in the future. But also developing a series of demonstrator prototypes as well, just so that we know it's all actionable. And they're exploring a couple of different themes within that. So one of them is around driving environment at HMI, and that is kind of exploring the driving environment and making it less complex and more flexible to meet the needs of every user. And they're also looking at access and space. So this could be exploring seating, doors and entry to make access to the vehicle more accessible, but also reimagining space to move inside the vehicle and maximize options for kind of spaciousness and storage. This work is kind of taking place now, and we're looking to publish some insights on that kind of mid to late next year. So please look out for it. But if you've got any questions, please reach out. And also I think it's useful to highlight that we know there are also technical and regulatory challenges on making EVs accessible for disabled people, especially in that kind of adaptations arena. There are kind of technical implications to certain adaptations working in electric vehicles, and we're working with the adaptations industry to explore those issues and how we might be able to address them as well. So I think this all just kind of goes to show that as we're transitioning, accessibility really needs to be thought about right at the beginning. And if you involve disabled people, there's a lot less concern for retrofitting and any kind of expensive things that you'll be considering at the latter point. And that's me. So I'll stop sharing and open to any questions.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. That's great to see. Any questions in the chat? I think there are many comments at the moment. So while people gather their thoughts, just one from me, if I may. You mentioned that full compliance with the PAS has been a bit slow, and that's because of specific parts that industry is finding it hard to implement. Are you able to tell us any more details on that, about sort of which aspects are more difficult than others?
Yeah, I could maybe share a little bit of anecdotal insight. So we know that that I think there are elements within the PAS around heights are causing a bit of a challenge, and I think some of that insight is it's whether or not the heights that we've set are maybe too high. So we're kind of exploring that, working with disabled people to make sure that the heights, if they could be adjusted, that would make charge points a lot easier. I think the main thing is that people are mostly purchasing their hardware from EU manufacturers, and there isn't a requirement or a standard in a lot of EU countries around accessibility. So if they're producing this hardware for the breadth of the EU, they're not necessarily going to think about making a specific set of hardware for the UK. So I think those are some of the key challenges that we're exploring. One of the big things is we're not trying to make the standard any less accessible. I just want to kind of clear that up, but we are looking at making it more implementable and ensuring that accessibility can be rolled out.
Brilliant. Understood. Thank you. And there's a question from Ben. Have you shared these initial findings with car makers, including the Callum WAV concept car developed in Warwick?
Yeah, so funnily enough, the Callum project is actually was commissioned by Motability Operations. So we're kind of working collaboratively with them. We're working on kind of standard production vehicles. They're working on the EWAV side, and we are trying to share as much of that insight across both of those projects as possible. But I think one of the big things is for us is we want to get a lot of this insight boiled down on the vehicle design side before we start speaking to manufacturers about that work. But Designability are starting to discuss the insights as they work through, with the hope that maybe we could foster innovation before any of these findings are published. But yeah, we know that none of this work can really be implemented without the engagement with these organisations.
And what's the end goal that you're imagining? Is it another standard or guidance that manufacturers can follow, or something
so
like regulation?
The aim, I think the main aim is we're going to start with guidance in the same way we did with the PAS standard, actually. So Designability developed a set of kind of user guidance and implementation guidance for manufacturers to understand how to make charge points and design charge points to be accessible. And we're doing the same thing with the vehicle design project as well. And that's the kind of the reason for developing these different demonstrator prototypes, to show that it is doable. But yeah, we're going to see how industry takes that, and if there is kind of need or requirement either for another standard or for more engagement with policymakers and with government. But we do, as I said, we have already started to form those relationships and think that it could really easily transition into kind of more work with them in the future if it's necessary.
Brilliant. Thank you. Look forward to following the progress. Well, if there's no more immediate questions now, just checking the chat. I think there's a few comments. Yes, okay, well, save them up for the end. Thank you very much, Chelsea. We'll move on to our next speaker, which is James Taylor, General Manager at Zipcar in the UK. James, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, George. Thank you. And hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Let me just share my slides. Give me a second. Hopefully you can all see that now. Yes, as George said, I'm James Taylor, General Manager of Zipcar here in the UK. Quick bit of intro and background to Zipcar for those of you that don't have a Zipcar. So we're the UK's largest car share operator. We've got over 500,000 members here in the UK, and we're based, operate purely in London at the moment. We've got 3,000 vehicles, that's cars and vans, and we're the only operator to have the back-to-base kind of traditional round-trip model and free-floating one-way in the same membership. In terms of our operations in London, so in round-trip, we're in pretty much every borough, and flex, we're currently in 15 boroughs and also 2 airports in London as well. And we have a consumer and business offer, and that business offer has over 13,000 businesses using us. In terms of our EV journey to date, so we had EVs in our fleet since 2018 and plug-in hybrids for a number of years before that. So we've built up a lot of operational knowledge and insight over that time. We started in our flex fleet, the kind of one-way fleet, primarily because they're generally shorter trips, they're city-based trips, so kind of EVs, perfect fleet option for that in particular. And then over the past year, we started to electrify a round-trip fleet and really understand kind of the implications, and as Joe was saying earlier, kind of what that means for a member experience, because round-trip vehicles tend to be longer trips. Members book in advance, so with their longer trips, there's more of a requirement for members maybe to charge mid-trips. How do we manage that? How do we manage back-to-back bookings where both users need it for a long trip, and maybe the previous user has used it and drained the battery close to zero? So all those kind of challenges we're trying to work through from a building understanding of EVs. We have a vision to be full electric by 2030, and I think you can see from some of the stats here on screen, we've done a great job so far since 2018 of bringing people into EVs and making them more accessible. Certainly from a use perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, we use rapid and ultra rapids, and we think that's key. From an operational perspective, the challenge for us is keeping the downtime as low as possible to a minimum to make the vehicles available. Obviously, it takes longer to charge an EV than does to refuel a petrol vehicles. How do we manage that? So we use a ultra rapid infrastructure to try and keep that as low as possible. But similarly, our members that are charging mid-trip, they're paying for that trip. They pay by the hour. So I guess when they're charging, they're paying as well. So generally speaking, they want to be using the rapids as well. So that's kind of the journey to date. In terms of today's topic around that kind of sustainable and an inclusive transition, I think I just want to pause for a moment just on kind of car sharing generally. We make access to EVs affordable and accessible for all. It's the same price a Zipcar to rent an EV as a rent a petrol vehicle, a comparable petrol vehicle. So even on that level, we're making it the same. But even now, kind of although the cost of EVs has dropped and come down over recent years, it's still prohibitive for many people to purchase an EV. It kind of excludes them from that transition. So car sharing has a key role to play, and there's some stats here from analysis that Como UK have done, just looking at those potential savings, and you can see quite significant annual savings if you kind of use a shared EV rather than kind of purchasing or leasing an EV. So just kind of thought useful just to highlight that. And then kind of keep that in mind for some of the points I'm discussing moving forward. We're committed to EVs and that transition. As I said, we've got that vision to be fully electric by 2030, but it comes with its challenges. And these are the three that we think are kind of key to that transition and making sure that, as well as being a sustainable transition in terms of making transport more sustainable, I think it's important that transition is also sustainable for businesses, and that kind of we can afford to make that move to EV. What we're seeing from a cost of operating perspective is that operating EVs in car clubs is significantly higher than ICE vehicles. We've got higher upfront costs. The in-life costs are higher. The resources that we need. So as Joe mentioned earlier, kind of with experience from other operators, that need to kind of shuttle back and forth to charge points incurs costs. You have more resources that you need to be able to do that. So there's costs there, but we're also seeing kind of significant costs kind of at the end of life as well, kind of falling used sales for EVs. So that's kind of something that we're having to grapple with as a business. We don't want to pass on that cost and kind of charge members more to access an EV because that would put people off. So we're absorbing some of that cost ourselves currently. But at the same time, member adoption is also a challenge. Those stats that I showed a couple of slides ago, clearly we're doing a good job of bringing people into EVs, but that's predominantly been in our flex service, which is, as I say, those shorter trips. What we're seeing is for round trip in particular, there is a difference in utilisation rates. So where members have the choice of an EV or a petrol vehicle for a longer trip in particular, more often than not, they're choosing a petrol vehicle rather than an electric one. And we think, there's obviously things that why that might be the case. There's the range anxiety or perceived hassle of having to charge mid-trip. But what that means in practice for us as a business is that we're seeing lower utilisation and therefore lower revenue from those vehicles that's already costing us more to operate. So kind of how do we address that? How do we kind of bring members with us to improve that adoption and kind of give them confidence to take those journeys for longer trips as well? And then finally, infrastructure. So, you know, it's definitely improving, and it's improved significantly in recent years, and the work that boroughs are doing to put more infrastructure in is really welcome. But I think it's still a challenge, and it's still quite patchy. You know, even, you know, whilst there's been maybe some great work in parts of the country, and I'm not just about London in this case, you know, it's about kind of the spread of infrastructure across the country. And I think that feeds into that confidence that members have, you know, when they're taking the vehicle for a longer trip. Will there be a charge point en route that I can use, and will it be available? Will it be working? All those kind of things start to kind of come into play. So I think, you know, more of the work that's already been done in infrastructure is great, and kind of understanding how that impacts on user behavior and user confidence to take those longer trips. So I think, you know, I think there's progress in all of these. I think kind of we need to work with all of these areas together to kind of to improve those, to make that transition to EV, certainly from a business perspective, much more sustainable, and kind of bringing those costs down and that usage up, so it's kind of sustainable to continue to grow that EV fleet that we have. But I guess thinking more broadly about sustainability and kind of, you know, how we make sure that our impact on the environment is as low as possible. We start to think around, you know, the challenge, particularly for round trip and electrifying round trip, and, you know, as Joe mentioned earlier, some of the work that's underway in Hackney to address that kind of in-bay charging. So that's definitely one route, and, you know, we're keen to hopefully be successful in that tender and kind of learn from that pilot to understand what happens with the dedicated in-bay charging. But I guess there's some questions around: is it realistic for every car club bay to have a dedicated charge point? Are there characteristics of usage that maybe means in dedicated in-bay wouldn't work? You know, does it work from a CPO perspective? You know, are they getting sufficient revenue from a one bay to one charge point to one car club ratio? So, you know, is that going to be realistic? And if not, then what do we need to do beyond that? You know, without that dedicated in-bay charging, as I said already, we need to shuttle to and from our charge points. That increases the empty miles. It's using energy to shuffle back and forth. So kind of we've been asking ourselves, are there any other options? And been going out to the market to look at what's out there, what can we use as alternatives. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is mobile charging, and mobile rapid charging in particular. And I think the point here is, I don't think there's one solution that is the golden bullet, the sort of silver bullet that fits everything and sorts everything. I think there'll be a mix of solutions, a mix of charging infrastructure that will be needed, whether it's dedicated, whether it's rapid, whether it's mobile. All of those things will need to work together to meet the specific requirement of the business. So I say we're kind of looking at mobile rapid charging, and kind of the benefit for us is the charge is brought to us, so that reduces that need for us to be shuttling backwards and forth. It reduces the resource requirements. So again, from a cost perspective, it kind of, you know, helps us there. So we're currently working with Use Energy. They're a Belgian startup that have just come to the UK. They develop their own battery technology, and they transport on purpose-built electric vehicles and cargo bikes to kind of bring the battery to the car. We're currently doing it in Lewisham, and they've given us permission to work with Use there to kind of test this, and really kind of fills the gaps in the existing network. So rather than kind of very heavy investment in kind of, you know, putting that across the whole location, and can we use mobile rapid charging companies like Use to really fill that gap in the network. So kind of much like Joe, I'd like to have given some stats and insight kind of how we're going so far. We actually literally started operations with them last week, so it's still very early days, but they're up and running. They're charging our vehicles. So just want to finish with a quick photo of them. The reaction for this is the mobile unit charging mobile vehicles in Lewisham. Early days, but kind of say as we'll start to learn more about how we can use that and how we can use that flexibility to kind of fit in with the other infrastructure that's available as well. So that was all. Thank you.
Thank you, James, very much. There's a comment in the chat about the high price of rapid charging. I wondered, with that mobile charging unit, how does the price per kilowatt stack up, or is that something you're looking to find out through the?
So I mean, it's a commercial agreement that we have with Use, and it's a good point that the cost of rapid charging has increased significantly. I think it's something like threefold in the past couple of years, and we're not seeing it come down at the same rate as cost of home electricity is as well. So we are, again, something else we're trying to grapple with. So part of the the saving for us currently is that we don't then have that. So it's the loss of energy. So kind of the shuttling back and forth, you're spending money to put the energy into the car and then shuttling it back to its home location. You've used some of that charge you've put in. So it's kind of wasteful. So, we've modelled it in that respect to see, but it's very much a, we're learning as we go with this, trying to see does it work from a cost perspective?
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. There's a couple of other questions come in. So question around how to increase car clubs in non-urban areas. Many people in rural areas are owning and running cars for a just-in-case scenario, so spending a lot each year on the off chance they may need to use their car. And many short trips from rural areas into urban areas could be met by having car clubs in place. Do you have a comment on that?
I think definitely there's a role for car clubs in all locations. We are primarily an urban car sharing solution. I think the UK is a long way from being at saturation point from car sharing. I think we're way behind Europe. We used to be a pretty similar level to many European cities. I think we've dropped back as a nation in car sharing, and I think we need more operators that will service different needs. More kind of that specialise in rural, specialise in suburban. I think we need that mix and that vibrancy of the sector to be able to serve all parts of the UK with viable alternatives to private car ownership.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then question on renewable energy. Are you able to use self-generated renewable energy to charge the mobile unit?
I'm not sure at the moment how they're doing that, but I think they are. Again, they're currently in their sort of setup mode, kind of trying to understand how they can do that. But yeah, the whole kind of sustainable piece is definitely a key part of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Okay. And then with the round trip offering, where there are dedicated and marked bays, are these on street only, or do you position these in places like train station car parks?
From a Zipcar perspective, most of ours are on street. I think there's a point about it being visible. We're part of what we see from when members join car clubs and make that shift from private cars to shared cars is part of it that they've seen car clubs on their street, they've seen them in their neighbourhood. So there's that visibility piece that's key. So I think things like stations, great. Sometimes car parks less great because it's kind of less visible. But yeah, we're keen to look at all ways to grow and promote car clubs in all locations.
Right, okay, and then we'll take one more and any others we can save to the end. So from Martin, is there any potential to offer incentives for users to charge during their trip? A bit like some of the e-bike share schemes gave credits for people bringing bikes back into zones.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's something we are actually doing. So we realised that it is a pain point for members having to charge mid-trip, and I think there's a period where we need to incentivise and encourage it. So the cost of fuel charges, including the cost of membership anyway, that's cost of the rental. So what we do is if a member charges mid-trip and brings the vehicle back over a certain charge level, we obviously, if they've had to pay for themselves, we refund the cost of the charge, but we also give them £20 driving credit as a thank you for that behaviour change and making sure that there's sufficient charge then for the next user to use. So yeah, it's a key. I think the whole education piece around how we shift that from to get people on board with charging it is key.
Great, thank you very much, James. We'll move on now to our last speaker, Roisin, but we'll bring James and others back at the end. So Roisin, Associate Technical Director for New Mobility at Arcadis, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Hopefully you can see my screen now. As George said, I'm Roisin Naughton. I'm an Associate Technical Director at Arcadis. So I lead up our Head of EV Strategy team. So working with lots of local, regional and government bodies to look at the transition to EV from all aspects. So providing various advisory services, strategy, feasibility, action planning to make the transition a success. I'm going to kind of touch on a couple of points that have been discussed already today, but from a much broader perspective. So covering again safety and accessibility, a lot of what we've heard of today, but also the environmental aspect of sustainability. So material sustainability and life cycle assessment, and then land use, and actually touching on what James has just talked a little bit about there, some off-grid solutions, which will hopefully be interesting. So first of all, safety and accessibility. I've popped some images on screen there. I was going to do a bit of a mix and match, but I feel like it's actually too obvious where the kind of better and the worse examples are. I don't want to call them bad examples because I think any progress towards delivering infrastructure is obviously a good thing, and we're making progress to get more public EV infrastructure in the ground. But some of the more poorer examples are kind of on the left-hand side there that you can see. Generally kind of poorly lit. So we're looking at areas where nighttime hasn't been considered. So if you go to public charging points at nighttime, in car parks, is there sufficient lighting? Is there CCTV? Would you feel safe plugging in and charging at nighttime in these locations? Canopies, you'll see on the right-hand side there in big hub locations. Canopies are brilliant because you'll see in all of these examples, there's actually no cover from weather protection, from sunlight if it's really hot. So canopies offer that resilience to people using the infrastructure. I'm sure some of you will be aware from plugging in your vehicles, it's not a quick task all the time, making sure if you're not using pay-as-you-go that you're selecting the right tariff, that you're clicking on the right buttons. It's not a quick task, so you can be exposed to the elements for some time without that. Obviously, the other added benefit of a canopy is solar, so adding in that solar panels in there for additional backup on site of battery storage, which is also obviously really useful for running the site as well, and backup power. Thinking about accessibility, so the space between the charge points, you'll see in some of the better examples there, making sure there's enough space to either side of the bays so that people can navigate and move around. Obviously, there's no standard for where charging ports are on vehicles. They can be at the front, they can be at the side. So just making sure that bays are accessible to everybody and that there is access to the charge point itself. In some of the poorer examples, there are no bay markings, which can obviously have obvious problems there as well, but usually just not enough space to meander around. Bollards, somebody I saw picked up in the comments, bollard spacing is a real issue. So obviously installers want to protect their charge points where there might be a risk of a car reversing in or bumping into a charge point, and there being some electrical safety aspects from that. But actually the bollards really act as a barrier for those with accessible needs. So in wheelchairs, with crutches or other aids that they might need in accessing those charge points. So really giving consideration to other bollards needed. Could you put something else, something smaller that won't then limit people accessing the screens, and heights as well. So I know that was picked up in the PAS 1899. The screens on all of these in terms of actually initiating a charge are really high up. So actually considering where those screens and user interfaces are on charge points is a really big accessibility point. You'll see I've popped on the side there. So Arcadis are now accredited with ChargeSafe. So they are driving positive change in public EV charging. So they are complementary to PAS 1899, but they offer a much more comprehensive view of charge points. So there's 144-point charge point inspection, which is designed to ensure safe and reliable charging is available for everyone. So I actually became the first woman to be ChargeSafe accredited earlier this year, which was a shock in itself, but great to be a part of that. But part of that strategy is to rate the entire public EV charging network and share those ratings with other drivers. So making sure that drivers know what to expect if there's additional needs, making sure that those needs are met at charge points. So looking on Google, for example, or navigation apps that it might use to make sure that the charge points you select as part of your en route journey have all the requirements you're looking for, whether it be canopies, whether it be no bollards, looking at the height of the screens that we've talked about, which is part of the mission of ChargeSafe, which is really great. And the other objective being to maintain and improve safety and accessibility standards in the EV charge point network across the UK. So to create international best practice framework for public EV charge points. I'll move on now to the environmental aspect. So thinking about the material sustainability and life cycle assessment. So whilst EVs themselves are being introduced to decrease carbon emissions, we've got to consider the environmental implications of the vehicles and infrastructure that obviously powers them across their entire life cycle. I'm sure people on the call will be aware of the anti-EV narrative that we've seen a lot of in the media. And as part of that, a big speculation and stats that have been quoted over life cycle emissions, extraction of raw materials for battery manufacturing and particulate matter. Recent studies have actually combated a lot of these now, thankfully, with concerns about electric vehicles shown to be responsible for less greenhouse gas emissions than petrol or diesel vehicles. But this is only where energy from renewable sources plays a pivotal role, which we'll touch on a little bit in the usage phase. Obviously, there's opportunities, though, throughout the cradle-to-grave life cycle to reduce those emissions. So within the manufacturing phase, sustainable materials, local sourcing of materials and labour, though, again, commercially, this has been really challenging in the UK. With the likes of Britishvolt, the UK battery manufacturer, collapsing into administration in 2023. There's also really limited supply chain for UK-made electric vehicle infrastructure as well. So there are challenges around that commercially. And then finally, on that, the energy efficient manufacturing processes that can be employed to lower energy consumption and emissions through that process. Onto the usage phase. So the type of energy used to generate electricity for charging stations has been proven to be the single greatest factor that will determine its environmental footprint. So renewable energy should be used as a priority. And actually what we're seeing now through lots of public charging procurements is to mandate this requirement into contracts. So most public charging infrastructure that you'll be using now in the UK will have renewable energy sources for that electricity. Implementing smart charging strategies, optimize grid integration and minimize strain on the electrical grid, and maximize the use of renewable energy sources is really important. And then finally, the efficiency of the charging process really affects the amount of energy consumed and the overall environmental impact. We're seeing obviously lots of advancements in charging technologies now. Ultra rapid charging is one way, so where the vehicle is actually plugged in for less time, that reduces the inefficiencies and the energy loss, but also with things like vehicle to grid and wireless charging, that can actually improve the charging efficiency and optimize the energy usage as well. In the disposable phase, so there's uncertainty with the long-term environmental effects of EV battery manufacturing and disposal. However, it should be noted that batteries are performing and retaining their performance much better than anyone expected, really. So the usable life of batteries is much better than once thought at 100,000 miles or 7 years. So when we do start to see, and we are starting to see that now come through with second life applications, they're much more promising. So to be used as energy storage, as a second life in homes or in businesses, providing backup power and helping to balance the grid at times of peak demand. And then obviously improper disposal of lithium-ion batteries can lead to environmental contamination. So implementing responsible battery recycling programs and encouraging responsible consumer behaviour is really important. We are actually seeing, and we're working with lots of local authorities now that are looking to, through suppliers in their EVCI procurement, to have carbon reduction plans in place or to sign up to their own carbon charters that they're developing, usually not just specific to electric vehicle infrastructure, but across their entire supply chain. So we are seeing that a lot more now with public procurements coming out. And then finally on land use and off-grid. So whilst generally it's a really good thing that we're installing lots of EV charging points and developing that network across the entire UK, we have to be really sensitive to where these charging points go and think about the actual other environmental impacts that installing these can have in terms of impact on biodiversity and displacing habitats. So one example that we were involved in, so I was an expert witness in a public inquiry in the South Downs National Park, where a developer put forward a proposal for an eco-lodge development with service station type facilities and over 100 public charge points on site. Some of these were dedicated to their eco-lodges that were being delivered, but others were a charging hub for visitors and users of the national park visiting and going out walking for the day. It was rejected by the National Park on a number of grounds, mainly that it was considered a major development. It was contrary to local policies. They didn't deem it to provide satisfactory biodiversity net gain, and there were some safety concerns just because of the access and egress from the highway. We were on the side of the developer stating, and actually from analysis, this was part of the strategic road network of the National Park. It was a desert for any EV, electric vehicle infrastructure surrounding the location. So there was a real need for charging infrastructure in this location. But that's not to say that this is going to be the case all the time. So obviously a single approach to each and every case is needed. Looking at whether a hub is needed in all circumstances. In this case, it was. But is it needed? Could single double socket provision be enough? Looking at innovative solutions to reflect that sensitivity of some of those locations and the importance of wildlife and the cultural heritage, pop-up charge points or other innovative solutions we're now seeing come to market that are more non-obtrusive to the landscape. And then finally, off-grid solutions to avoid additional infrastructure for grid upgrades and connections. So in this case, all of the EV charge points and the eco lodges were to be run from biofuel, so an off-grid solution, recognizing that it would limit the amount of damage to the natural environment in terms of facilitating grid upgrades in these rural locations and grid connections where they don't currently exist. So that's where I come on to off-grid solutions. We are seeing a lot more of that now come to market. And I just wanted to point out here, one solution is hydrogen generators that we're seeing come to market. In terms of case studies, there's a really good one for Ministry of Defence, who are at the moment struggling with the length of time for grid upgrades in the UK, obviously taking from 12 to 18 months, even beyond, we're hearing, and the obviously high capital cost of those. So what they're doing in the meantime is installing hydrogen generators in their car parks for their fleets to connect to EV chargers. So there's an image up there of the top. They're very shipping container size, so quite well contained. And then you connect them to the EV charge points. You can connect them as slow, fast, and rapid. The only thing that will change is the amount of hydrogen that needs to be delivered to site to fuel those charge points. We've seen a number of successful rollouts of this, MOD being one. Boomtown Festival in 2022 was kind of one of the first locations to roll it out and successfully deliver that site from fully hydrogen generators. And then we've also seen it successfully deployed on multiple highway construction projects as well. Solution being, it's a fully zero emission, and I have asterisks that there because that depends on the type of hydrogen that you're using. We won't go into that in detail here, but green hydrogen, if it's green hydrogen, then it's fully zero emission. There's no infrastructure upgrades required. There's really short lead-in times. You know, you could get one in a couple of weeks to a month, and there's a completely flexible deployment to your needs. So, for example, with construction projects, we've worked with a couple of clients to identify where there is going to be maintenance works happening, where they've got a fleet of EVs traveling to site and where they might need some support, but just for a month or 2 months while they've got some work happening on these sites. This is a really brilliant solution for that, where you don't need permanent fixtures and upgrades to facilitate EV charging. So I think that brings me to an end. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Roisin. Any questions in the chat for Roisin? One quick one while I wait. I don't know if it's quick, but the hydrogen off-grid solution is really interesting. How does the cost stack up? I realize that might be quite a complex question, but do you have broad numbers on that compared to?
It definitely depends. It depends how long. It depends how much hydrogen. So how many hydrogen deliveries you would need to power your charge points. How many vehicles are using the charge points? But it's very cost competitive, obviously, against anything where you're putting in permanent solutions or grid upgrades. So yeah, certainly if people are interested, we can get some quotes to look at, but cost competitive from what we've found. The price of hydrogen, it's obviously a different topic to today, but that is struggling to be competitive at the moment, but we're expecting that to improve in future, which can only help that commercial case for off-grid solutions.
Thank you. And there's a question from Antonia. How does ChargeSafe link to or overlap with the PAS guidance that Chelsea spoke about?
So as I say, yeah, very complementary. Neither one kind of objects or contradicts any of that the others say. I would just say ChargeSafe probably takes it that one step further, where they're actually looking with the 144-point inspection. It's not just about the charge point itself. It's looking at, as we talked about, the locations, where the charge points are. Is there CCTV? Is it close to, active routes with pedestrians, other users, close to a roadway? So it just looks at more of that context of where the charge point is, as well as the charge point itself.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we're nearly out of time, so if I could ask the other speakers to come back on camera, please, and we'll work through last questions for the group. And I promised I would go back and cover the ones we missed earlier. So there were a couple for you, Joe, to start off with, please. So one from Ben Waller. How do you engage with car club members on education of the use of battery electric vehicles to overcome misinformation and genuine concerns over driving experience? Maybe James, you have a comment on this as well. But
Yeah,
Joe,
that's. Am I on mute? No, you can hear me.
we can hear you.
That's a really good question. I think that's one of the key questions, and one that we're going to be testing in this 12-month pilot as well. So I think things along the lines of working with the operators and setting up meetings between the operators and the EV charging operator to understand how the information can be clear and accessible to users. Ultimately, we haven't, in terms of the EV car clubs, haven't got a lot of data to kind of back that up, but that's what the next 12 months is going to be showing. But I mean, HireCar, for example, have done really good how-to videos and instructional videos and things along those lines. So I think the proof will be in the pudding a little bit, and we'll find out in the coming weeks when we get the vehicles in the bays. But there's definitely a big education and behavior change component piece to all of that we're trying to explore with the operators that we're going to be working with, to see if we can unlock the mass adoption of car clubs and really engage and raise awareness with users.
Thank you. James, you touched on this in your talk about how you're sort of seeing differences in utilization for round trips. Yeah, what do you guys do to educate users on trying to overcome that range anxiety factor and so on?
Very similar to what Joseph HireCar be doing as well. I mean, I think we're in that phase of probably over communicating, kind of give as much information as possible. So in all of our electric vehicles, we have a QR code, so members can scan that with information specific to that vehicle model, but also with videos of kind of how you charge that vehicle, with the confusion around different charge cables and that kind of thing. So just trying to kind of think about every questions our members might have and try to address those up front, but kind of recognizing through the pilot that Hackney is running, we'll probably get even deeper insights and trying to use that along with our kind of member insights, trying to really build up where are those pain points. We think we know them. We think we're trying to address it with, I say, kind of the educational videos, but there might be other things that we're kind of missing that we'll pick up as well through the pilot, hopefully.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, and we've got a question for Chelsea from Nana Sinter. What is being done for people who have ambulant disabilities and may need somewhere to place a crutch or crutches while using the equipment? Crutches can fall over and be a hazard.
Yeah, thanks for that one. I saw it in the chat and I was just pulling together my notes to answer that one. So I think one of the big things is it sometimes feels like we focus on wheelchair users, but all of our work looks at the kind of breadth of disability. So we look at kind of physical disabilities across the spectrum and also non-visible disabilities as well. So the work that we did with designability on both the EV charging work and also the vehicle design work is looking at kind of all factors. But I will take that point away actually and make sure that's fed into that PAS 8099 review of the standard, because it may be something that isn't considered around kind of, if we're looking at the physical charge point and also the space around it, possibly what users of the charge point might actually already have with them that they need. So yeah, thanks Anne for that bit of insight. I'll make sure we take it forward.
Well, thank you. And one from Beth Morley. I think this is for you, Joe. Will the cables be tethered for the EV car club chargers?
Yeah, that's another good question. So Zest, our EV charging operator, wanted to make sure that the car club vehicles had the cables in them. So the charging points themselves don't have the cables, and involved a little bit of solution searching with the car club operators, most of which have, I think, kind of like a bike lock kind of system or bike cable lock in the vehicle to attach the EV charging cable. I didn't realize how expensive these things were. So apparently they're quite expensive, but yeah, so the cables are in the vehicles rather than on the charging points.
Great, thank you. And then there's a couple more, I think. So another one from Ben Waller, making the point that the UK is slipping behind other countries. So I think this is for Joe and James, but anyone welcome to chip in. What can operators and local transport authorities do to help support mandate the development and uptake of multimodal apps that help car sharing become fully integrated?
Yeah. So like a mobility as a service.
Yeah.
Sorry, was that to me or was that to somebody else?
Yeah, I think it's directed at operators and local authorities. So I think Joe, James, but anyone.
So I'll just say very quickly that as part of we're doing this pilot, and then next year we're doing a wider tender, a shared mobility tender. So that's not just for car clubs, but also for our cycle hire as well. So we're doing the kind of cycle hire service together with car clubs, and with that there are going to be opportunities for integration for the applications and mobile apps. So it's something that we haven't got yet. So I know that I think Kent County Council introduced mobility as a service last year or something. We definitely want to try and work with operators to try and see how it's possible. And it's something we're going to be exploring as part of the tenders, try and find solutions to that.
If I can jump in as well, I think it's definitely part of the solution. I think there's more we need to do just to kind of grow provision of car clubs here in the UK generally. I think we from a national basis we don't really have any policy that is targeted specifically for car sharing. The only thing really for a national level is the ZEV mandate, which is more around the supply of EVs into the car sharing rather than policies that incentivise or promote car sharing as an alternative. So I think there's work to do there first to try to make UK a more receptive place for car sharing. I think once you get more operators, growth of it, that helps. And then similarly alongside that, as Joe was saying, kind of having other options as well. For car sharing to work, you need other things alongside it. So shared bikes, shared scooters, good public transport infrastructure. It's all those things that have to be in place. People will be able to give up their private car with confidence that they'll be able to get around and have those modes of transport that they need for the trips that they need to make.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. We are out of time, but there's one last question that's just come in. What's the optimum distance between EV car share hubs in cities? It's directed at you, James.
That's a very good question. I'd love to know. I think part of the beauty of the trial, hopefully with Hackney, is that we'll get some of these insights around what does it do to member behaviour. How far they're willing to walk to get to an EV car as opposed to a petrol car. I think we're some way away from there being lots of hubs for EVs. I think we need to get that insight first to understand how we deliver the optimal solution from a council perspective, from an operator perspective, and from a member perspective as well.
I'll just say quickly that we aim to have a car club vehicle every 200 meters in Hackney. So a really short walk. Those won't necessarily all be EV car club vehicles. But with this pilot, we have one dedicated car club fast charging bay in each of the wards in the borough to try and make sure that it's equitable and distribution is even across the borough as well.
Fantastic. Well, we're out of time. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Please give a virtual round of applause to Roisin, James, Chelsea and Joe. The next session starts at 3:15, as you can see on the screen. This is about changing behaviour with shared transport. Thanks also to the sponsors of this conference, Arcadis and SLR. And thank you to everyone for joining. And please do a last round of applause for the speakers.